Hello everybody, and thanks for clicking on this video. I was working on a Fusion 360 project that generated a large number of separate bodies. At some point, I needed to export all of those parts so I could prepare them for 3D printing. That is when I realized an obvious problem. Exporting each body one by one would be a long, repetitive, and frankly painful process. So instead of manually exporting every part, I decided to create a Fusion 360 add-in to automate the process. At the time of releasing this video, the add-in is called Multi 3D Print, although the name may change in the future. The idea is simple. Instead of using Fusion's normal file 3D print workflow one part at a time, this add-in lets you batch export multiple bodies or components, choose the export format, set the unit and mesh quality, and even apply export rotation before the files are created. I will be releasing this add-in for free on the Fusion 360 App Store. If you find it useful, please leave a comment below. And if you have another repetitive Fusion 360 task that you think could be turned into an add-in, describe it in the comments. If I understand the workflow, and it is realistic to implement, I may attempt it. Here's the project I was working on. I'm not going into the details of this actual mechanism in this video because the subject today is the add-in itself. Let's begin. To launch the add-in, I go to Create, then select Multi 3D Print. As mentioned earlier, the name may change before release, so the button name you see in the final version may be slightly different. This opens the Multi 3D Print dialog. The interface is deliberately simple. At the top, there is the selection scope. This controls whether the add-in exports all bodies or only the bodies and components I select manually. For the first example, I will use all bodies. With this option, I do not need to select anything manually. The add-in will scan the design and export every valid body it can find. Next, I choose the export format. For this first example, I will use 3MF. Then I choose the output folder. I already have the directory in this input box, so the add-in will create the exported files in that location. Now I click OK. The add-in runs the export, and once it finishes, the files are ready in the selected folder. To prove that the files were exported correctly, I will open Bamboo Studio and import the exported 3MF files. I go to File, Import, select the exported files, and open them. This message appears because the 3MF file was created outside Bamboo Studio. It is not an error, so I can click OK and continue. Bamboo Studio may show a unit warning if one of the bodies is very small. In this case, I know the units are already correct, so I will not rescale the parts. Now the files are imported. At this point, you can see the real reason I made this add-in. There are many separate parts here. Exporting all of these manually from Fusion 360 would be a nightmare. So that is the first feature, quick batch export of all bodies. But that is only the first part of the add-in. The more useful feature is selective export with export rotation. This time, I will change selection scope to selected bodies components. Now I can choose exactly which bodies or components I want to export. I will select the main component groups in the browser. The next option is mesh format. The add-in supports STL, OBJ, and 3MF. For this example, I will choose STL. I will keep this as binary. The unit is set to millimeter, which is what I want for this project. Now we get to the important section, export rotation. This section allows me to rotate bodies or components during export without changing the actual Fusion 360 model. That is the key point. I do not have to rotate my real components in the design just to make them printable. The add-in applies the rotation only to the exported file. The checkbox called Show Full Component Tree expands or collapses the selected items inside the add-in itself. This is useful because, in a real assembly, some bodies are already in the correct orientation, while others need to be rotated before printing. I will start with the shaft assembly. As you can see here, when an item is selected, it is highlighted on the Fusion 360 canvas. I will change the rotation angle to 90 degrees around the x-axis. The preview does not show the selected export orientation on the canvas, but the rotation will be applied when the file is exported. There are other shafts that are vertical, and I can show them more clearly by enabling a section view. I will also rotate these shafts by 90 degrees around the x-axis. There are also some pulleys that are not in the orientation I want for printing. If I orient the canvas correctly, I can see the correct way to rotate them. These pulleys will be rotated by 180 degrees around the x-axis. I will now change the output folder to 002, then click OK. Let's go back to Bamboo Studio and import the exported STL files. I select all the files in the new output folder and open them. Again, if Bamboo Studio asks about scaling because of small parts, I will keep the original units because the export was already set to millimeters. Now the parts are imported. This time, the important thing to notice is the orientation. The shafts are now horizontal, as expected by 90 degrees rotation. The pulleys that face the wrong way in the assembly are now facing upward for printing. That is the main benefit of this add-in. It combines batch export with per-body export rotation. Without this add-in, I would either need to rotate the parts manually in Fusion before exporting, or fix every part one by one inside the slicer. This keeps the actual assembly correct, while still giving me print-ready files. I believe this add-in will be useful for professionals and hobbyists alike. These days, many companies use 3D printers as part of their design workflow, allowing them to test parts in-house before committing to full manufacturing. For that kind of workflow, being able to export many print-ready files quickly can save a lot of time. So far, we have demonstrated rotating individual bodies. But what about components? The add-in can also rotate an entire component group. Let's go back to Fusion 360. I will select the main groups once more. This time, instead of rotating each body individually, I can apply the rotation at the component level. Any bodies inside that component group will then use that rotation during export. I will set this to 90 degrees around the y-axis. The expected behavior is that all bodies under this component use the same y-axis rotation. However, I can see that some entries are currently using the Z-axis instead. The angle itself is correct for all the bodies, 90 degrees. The issue is only the selected axis. I will manually correct those before exporting. I have an idea why this is happening, and I will look into it later, but the main component level rotation workflow still works. I will save this export to folder 003, then click OK. Now I will go back to Bamboo Studio and check the result. As you can see, the entire component group has been rotated by 90 degrees. Now let's look at the output folder option. If I leave the output directory blank, the add-in will ask me where I want to save the exported files. I will create a new folder and call it 004, then click OK. The export is complete. Again, I will go back to Bamboo Studio and here are the files I just exported. So in summary, Multi-3D Print allows you to export all bodies from a Fusion 360 design, export only selected bodies or components, choose STL, OBJ, or 3MF, choose binary or ASCII STL, set the export unit, set the mesh refinement quality, apply rotation during export, rotate individual bodies, rotate whole component groups. The add-in also highlights selected bodies using a rectangular marker, which helps confirm what is being edited. There may be small changes before release, including the final name, but the core workflow is already in place. For me, this turns a slow manual export process into a much faster batch export workflow. The add-in will be released for free on the Fusion 360 App Store. If you like the add-in or have ideas for automation, leave a comment below. Thanks again for watching, and watch out for the Multi-3D Print add-in. It has a colorful icon, so you will not miss it.